Okay, perfect. We are live for our third installment of our Ask an Expert series. I have a couple of new physicians here with me today representing the FDA and talking about their involvement in hematological malignancy research, as well as Dr. Irene Ghobrial. I'm going to give a brief introduction to everyone, go through the format, and then we'll get started on some of the questions. So to start off, I'm going to introduce our three physicians. Dr. Nicole Gormley is a board-certified hematologist who currently serves as the FDA's acting director for the Division of Hematologic Malignancies 2, which focuses on drug evaluation and research. In this role, she actively engages with the multiple myeloma community on the development of novel endpoints, including minimal residual disease and methods to address racial disparities. She's an active member of the American Society of Hematology and has authored or co-authored at least 14 peer-reviewed journal articles. Dr. Gormley's clinical research focuses on hematology and multiple myeloma. We also have Dr. Bindu Kanapuru, who is the medical officer for the FDA's Center for Drug Evaluation and Research in the Office of Hematology and Oncology Products. Her professional interests include the treatment of hematological malignancies, geriatric oncology, and patient-reported outcomes. Dr. Kanapuru has an extensive background in adult and geriatric hematology and oncology, and did her research training on mechanisms of unexplained anemia and cancer incidence in older adults at the National Institutes of Aging, where she co-authored multiple publications and book chapters. She is board certified in hematology, medical oncology, and internal medicine. Dr. Irene Ghobrial is a professor of medicine at the Dana-Farber Cancer Institute, Harvard Medical School, and an associate member of the Broad Institute in Cambridge. She is the director of the Clinical Investigator Research Program at the Dana-Farber Cancer Institute, co-director of the Center for Prevention of Progression, and co-leader of the Blood Cancer Research Partnership. Her research focuses on understanding mechanisms of tumor progression from early precursor conditions such as monoclonal gammopathy of undetermined significance and smoldering disease to symptomatic multiple myeloma and Waldenstrom's macroglobulinemia. Thank you all for being with us today. We're very excited for our third installment of the Ask an Expert series. So I'm going to give a quick outline of what we're going to be doing on the webinar today, and then give some tips on how to submit questions if you do have them as they come up. I know some people did submit them before the webinar. And then I'm going to ask Irene to very quickly give an introduction on the precursor conditions of MGUS and smoldering, as well as multiple myeloma, and then we'll get started. So we have three different sections today we're going to go through. We're going to answer some questions on the FDA's role in disparities research, as well as hematologic malignancy research, the FDA's drug development approval process, as well as how that's related to COVID right now, and then treatment and research in general on hematologic malignancies. As usual, you can comment on the side of the YouTube video if you do have a question that comes up during the course of this webinar. This is a public chat, so if you do put something in there, your name is going to be attached to it. If you prefer to email us and make it a private, have it be a private question, please email us at our precursor@partners.org email. Most of you should have that, but it's precursor@partners.org. We will be recording this webinar just like our other ones and posting it afterwards. And then my last little comment before we get started is I know a lot of people submitted questions, and actually there were a lot of duplicates, which is great because it means that we're able to focus on very particular topics. But some of the questions you submitted were answered in previous webinars. And if you access our YouTube channel, which is the Promise Study YouTube channel, you'll be able to actually look at our past two webinars, and some of those earlier questions might have been answered in the other one. So we're going to really focus on new questions to make sure that we're covering as much as possible. All right, thank you again, everyone, for being here, and I think we are ready to get started. So if I could ask Dr. Ghobrial to begin by giving a brief introduction to MGUS, smoldering multiple myeloma, and multiple myeloma.
Absolutely. Thank you, Annie. And I just want to start by thanking Nicole and Bindu so much, because I know that currently you guys are extremely busy in the FDA with all of the applications, with all of the things that are going on with COVID-19. So we just want to thank you for taking the time and spending it with us. And hopefully the patients all and everyone appreciates all the amazing efforts you're doing on behalf for all of us. So I just want to introduce, I think many people know what multiple myeloma is, what MGUS and smoldering are. What we want to emphasize today is that we know that for every single case of myeloma that we see, every patient who comes to us today with myeloma would have had an earlier case of MGUS or smoldering myeloma, meaning a precursor condition to your disease, and yet we didn't diagnose it because we don't screen for it, we don't go looking for it. And we know for other cancers like breast cancer, like colon cancer, we screen for those. And in fact, cancer screening saves lives. And this is one of the messages that we're trying to do. We're trying to say, can we, for this new era of time, can we look for MGUS early on? And if we can find it early, can we then prevent progression? Can we someday in the future not diagnose anyone with active myeloma? So just to remind everyone, active myeloma is a cancer of the plasma cells that are in your bone marrow, and they secrete immunoglobulins, which are the antibodies that act for preventing infections. And in fact, this is so important now, especially with COVID-19, because we're going to ask all of those questions of what happens if I have myeloma and I get COVID-19? What if I recover from it? Will I have a good immune system to recover if I have myeloma or MGUS or smoldering? These are all questions that we don't know the answer for right now. So it's very important, especially for cancer patients and especially for myeloma patients or smoldering or MGUS who have already a problem with making good antibodies to fight infections. Now, MGUS is also a very, very common disease. And in fact, a paper just came out today from Vince Rajkumar and many others showing us that MGUS is as common as 5% of the population over the age of 50. That means that many of us, over 3-4 million people, are walking around with MGUS, and that number is very high. And the hope is that we can truly identify it early so that we can prevent myeloma, so that we can prevent people from having bone lesions, anemia, organ failure, basically kidney disease. The hope is that truly we diagnose you early and treat you early before you develop the active disease.
Thank you, Dr. Ghobrial. And two of the really large efforts that Dr. Ghobrial's team is leading with regards to those precursor conditions is the PROMISE study as well as the PCrowd study. I just want to quickly detail the difference between those two projects. The PROMISE study is a screening study for multiple myeloma. It's for high-risk individuals. So that means that they either have a first-degree family member who has multiple myeloma or a precursor condition, or individuals of African descent. And we're going to come back to why individuals of African descent are eligible for this study in a little bit. But this is a screening study, so it's free to the individuals who are eligible for it. And you can find more information on the PROMISE study at www.promisestudy.org. I know we have a lot of PROMISE study listeners on today. The other, what we call the sister study to the PROMISE study, is the PCrowd study. The PCrowd study is for individuals who already have a diagnosis of a precursor condition. This could be MGUS, this could be smoldering multiple myeloma, or it could be another condition such as MDS or MBL. And we have a lot of listeners listening in today who are PCrowders. PCrowders submit regular blood samples and tissue samples to our team that really support the really important research, understanding why precursor conditions evolve sometimes into multiple myeloma or other hematologic malignancies. So with a little bit of background on those two studies, I know we've talked about them in some other webinars. Dr. Ghobrial, can you really briefly explain how did these two studies contribute to understanding why MGUS and smoldering progress to multiple myeloma, and what have we already learned from them?
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you, Annie. So again, PROMISE and PCrowd are sister studies, and they're basically tissue banking studies. We're asking everyone who has those diseases or people who have a high risk for developing myeloma, meaning if you're African American or if you're African of origin, or if you have a high risk because your family members, a brother, sister, mom, or dad have myeloma or have MGUS or smoldering disease, you are at a higher chance of developing this. And the study is really asking the question, can we look for it? We screen for it in your case with a blood sample, so that's very simple. And then we ask the question, what makes someone progress to myeloma in their lifetime while others don't? And by understanding better what are the cancer cells that lead to progression and what are the immune cells around it that can lead to progression, we can hopefully develop future therapies and then go back to the FDA and say, here are the studies that we have, here's the drugs that we look for to prevent progression in the future. And this is basically trying to understand why you would have a marker that makes you progress to myeloma, and can we use that marker to develop drugs that can prevent progression in your case. And in fact, we just got 2 papers out recently, and we're happy to share them with everyone. This is from the samples of people who signed up on PCrowd and PROMISE, so thank you for that, because it's truly the patients who make a difference for us. And we found that we can find mutations and specific markers in your cancer cells that can define who will progress to myeloma. So now, instead of calling high-risk smoldering myeloma only based on clinical markers like your M spike or your light chains or your bone marrow percentage, and we know that those markers are not very accurate in predicting who is at high risk, now we have something called KRAS, MAP kinase mutations, MYC translocations, things that we can actually find in your own cancer cells that can tell us if you are at high risk of developing myeloma. And we're hoping to use those in the future so that when we enroll you on a clinical trial, when we say that you are at high risk, we have a better definition of what is high risk for smoldering myeloma. So that was one step forward. The second one is we also did something called single cell sequencing of the immune cells, which means we looked at your own immune cells in the bone marrow that we take from patients, and we looked at all of the immune cells, and we found that even at MGUS, even at early stages of MGUS, your own immune system is not working very well. And it actually has a lot of changes already compared to a healthy individual. And that would be very important, especially now in the era of COVID-19, now in the era of vaccinations and immunotherapy for the future. So all of these studies are not just for us to understand better the disease, but hopefully to bring to you therapy in the future to prevent progression.
Thank you so much, Dr. Ghobrial. That really speaks to the importance of the PROMISE and PCRUD studies, as well as other multiple myeloma research being done across the country. I had mentioned earlier that individuals who identify as being of African descent are eligible to participate in the PROMISE study above a certain age. And that's because we know African Americans and individuals of African descent are at increased risks for developing precursor conditions to multiple myeloma, as well as the overt disease itself. Dr. Gormley, I was wondering if you could speak on the importance of providing screening opportunities to these historically marginalized communities, and why does an early diagnosis of, for example, MGUS, benefit these patients?
Yeah, so I think you really highlighted on a really important issue, in that we do see differences in the incidence of developing MGUS and smoldering multiple myeloma in African Americans compared to Caucasians. And unfortunately, the issue is that there's a lot that we still don't know. So we don't know a lot right now currently about differences in the underlying etiology, or if different therapeutic approaches might be helpful based on race, ethnicity, that sort of might mirror some of the underlying differences in cytogenetics, et cetera. And so this lack of knowledge really underscores the importance of having clinical trials. And when we look at the demographic data in the clinical trials that we have had just in multiple myeloma, we see very large disparities in that very significant underrepresentation of African Americans, Hispanics, and also limited data on Asians. And so when we have this limited data, it's hard really to know if the findings that we see in these clinical trials are really broadly applicable to these other underrepresented populations. And so it really underscores the importance of having enrollment of a diverse patient population so that we can have ultimately, be able to answer these questions for all patients. So this is really an important aspect of this.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for offering that. And I know during the current pandemic with COVID-19 that actually a lot of institutions are having to modify or adopt new policies for their current clinical trials, their current screening trials. Can you talk about the importance of the role that you do now and the current efforts that exist to fill the digital divide that sometimes exists for patients who have limited access to telemedicine, particularly when we're thinking about socioeconomic status and what groups fall into those categories?
Yeah, so there's a lot that we're doing within the Oncology Center of Excellence. And I'll back up just a bit to share a little bit about the FDA. There are multiple divisions and centers within the FDA that handle oncology products. There's the Center for Biologics Evaluation and Research, CBER. They handle products for vaccines. They handle blood products, blood components, et cetera. So things like convalescent plasma, as we're thinking about this COVID epidemic. Then there's CDER, which is the center that I'm within, the Center for Drug Evaluation and Research. And we handle drugs small molecules, biologics such as monoclonal antibodies, et cetera. And then there's also the device, Center for Devices, Radiological Health, CDRH, and they handle, antibody testing. They handle also any types of diagnostic tests. And so there are multiple groups and centers within the FDA that handle oncology products. And the Oncology Center of Excellence was created in 2017 to sort of provide a broad, overreaching opportunity to sort of integrate the oncology experience. So they oversee products within each of these centers to make sure that there's a patient-focused approach that's also very collaborative, and specifically with an oncology focus. And so during this pandemic, there have been multiple challenges. There have been challenges for patients, particularly those with cancer. There have been challenges for the clinicians that are providing care, and then also for those that are conducting clinical trials. And so we've really tried to come alongside a lot of different groups, and also we tried to provide guidance from our perspective on the clinical trials as to some flexibilities and other areas to really sort of address the pandemic specifically. And so recently we issued a guidance on the conduct of clinical trials during COVID-19. And this guidance, again, it does not pertain to clinical care, but does provide and describe our recommended approaches for the conduct of clinical trials during the pandemic. And it offers a lot of flexibilities, specifically as it relates to making sure that first and foremost, safety, if a clinical trial is proceeding, that safety of the participants is paramount. And so along with that, making sure that any of the scheduled evaluations or monitoring, assessments are done in that light. And that, again, safety should be paramount. So perhaps instead of requiring, inpatient visits, that some of these visits could be conducted via telephone or remotely, via video messages or meetings, et cetera. Or having some of these assessments take place at the patient's home, center, and other flexibilities as well that are sort of outlined in that guidance. And again, I think, it sort of underscores that while clinical trials and even, especially during this time are of the utmost importance, that safety really it takes precedence when considering clinical trials during this time.
Thank you so much, Dr. Gormley. I think you really touched on an important point. I think a lot of lay people don't always have a full understanding of the various branches of the FDA and what exactly the FDA does. I know that sounds a bit silly, but it's very helpful to get a more in-depth understanding of the intricacies that go on behind the scenes to make sure that the clinical work that teams like the Ghobrial team do are effective and safe. So thank you so much for that. I'm going to turn to Dr. Kanapuru. I'm sorry that we're bringing you in a little bit late, but I know that you have a pretty extensive background in geriatric oncology, and a lot of our multiple myeloma patients are on the older end of the spectrum. I was wondering, what additional steps have you made to support geriatric patients in your own practice as well as in general? What are some important things to consider when we talk about telemedicine and the potential difficulties that come with that for some of our patients?
Yes, thank you, Annie. Yes, as you rightly pointed out, there's definitely many of these new cases, particularly in multiple myeloma. We know that almost half of the new cases that are diagnosed are in patients who are almost 69 to 70 years of age. And, just with the growing older segment of the population, we are expecting that there will be, more new cases in these old adults. So it's certainly very important to consider, how we can improve, even access to clinical trial participation, because clinical trial participation is the basis of the evidence that will give a strong evidence to make decisions regarding treatments, including drug approvals, as well as the best treatments for our patients. And so I'd just like to point out, like in my role in FDA, as well as in the Oncology Center of Excellence, as well as in our Office of Oncologic Diseases, we made a concerted effort to encourage enrollment of older adults in cancer clinical trials. Particularly because it's very important to enroll these patients to understand the benefit risk of these cancer drugs in this patient population. And so in general, even before the COVID-19 pandemic, FDA has engaged with multiple stakeholders. We've conducted workshops to look at various ways where we can increase, older adult participation in clinical trials. We understand that there may be several barriers, but one of the key barriers identified was, perhaps maybe a narrow eligibility criteria that's often included in the clinical trials. And so the FDA has engaged with multiple stakeholders to look into broadening eligibility criteria for clinical trials, particularly the organ function criteria, which we all know that many of the older patients may have underlying renal dysfunction, or even the way the renal criteria is calculated in these patients may be different, and so that might having a narrow organ function criteria, or even restrictions for cardiovascular diseases may prevent a lot of these older patients from enrolling onto the clinical trials. Again, as Dr. Gormley pointed out, safety is paramount, and so within if we are able to ensure that the patients can be safely enrolled, broadening eligibility criteria to ensure that we have these older patients who may have different comorbidities, including cardiovascular diseases, renal dysfunction, they can be enrolled, and we have an adequate evidence or adequate data to make treatment decisions for these patients. I think particularly, again, as Dr. Gormley pointed out, during this COVID-19 pandemic, the guidance specifically talks about some flexibility. And we also know that other than narrow eligibility criteria, some of the restrictions may be for the older patients, maybe difficulty in getting to the clinical trials. They might be having travel restrictions, or may not be able to go on to the clinical trial site at the specified time to get the required tests. And so this COVID-19 guidance, particularly about utilizing telehealth options, as well as possibly within be able to maintain the safety, and if there's adequate precautions for training at the alternate site, these patients can be still safely enrolled by utilizing some of the flexibilities that are mentioned in the COVID-19 guidance. So I think the FDA has definitely taken several steps in general by trying to ensure that we have an adequate representation of the older adults in clinical trials, which is really very important.
Thank you so much. I think it's so important to consider the fact that there are a lot of marginalized groups that are impacted by this disease. And so it is important to build these types of protocols and guidelines into clinical trials as well as treatment plans in general. So thanks so much for outlining that for us. I'm going to turn to Dr. Ghobrial now. And in general, this is kind of a summative end question for this first section. With all of these factors in mind, how do you believe that telemedicine will be used as a tool post-COVID-19? After all this is done, how will telemedicine be used to conduct follow-up care, particularly for MGUS and smoldering patients?
Yeah, Annie, thank you for that question. And I can tell you it was very interesting early on when I started my very first virtual clinic, right? My very first patient on telemedicine trying to go on Zoom, and the patient is also trying to go on Zoom, and we're trying to call each other. But after overcoming some of those difficulties of where are the labs, how to connect, I think it was amazing to have patients from Florida, California, upstate New York, places where in general it would have been extremely hard for them to come to see us at Dana-Farber, yet by doing a virtual visit we were able to do almost everything that we usually do other than a physical exam, and we're still looking into whether you can get a stethoscope online or not, but I'm sure there is an app for that. So I can tell you that I personally felt that that was a true patient advocacy effort that maybe COVID-19 had some positive things that we will go back and look at and say it was because of that we had to invent this new method of taking care of our patients. And now I'm offering many of my patients who actually would come usually to the clinic in person later on. We're trying to say, well, if we can keep virtual clinics, if we can keep telemedicine for you, I would rather keep it. Go get your labs locally, send them to me, and we will go from there. Other than the physical exam, again, we're having everything there, especially for patients like the precursor conditions, MGUS and smoldering myeloma. You're not requiring active therapy in most cases. So the active part is truly talking to you, making sure you don't have symptoms and signs, making sure your labs are okay, and offering that care to everyone across the nation and potentially even internationally would be such a great advantage that we started thinking maybe we will turn CPOP, or our Center for Prevention of Progression, into part of it being virtual, part of it being able to provide care for other people. I think the one thing that Nicole had touched on is having or making sure that everyone has access to that, because the last thing we want is we actually increase disparity by having people sign up on Zoom and others don't have an online and internet option. So we want to make sure that we are offering this, but offering it everywhere to everyone, and potentially having phone calls to other people, or providing, the apps, providing things for everyone so that we can really provide care to many others. But I see virtual care happening and staying with us post-COVID-19, and potentially we learn a lot from this and have it as a positive experience rather than something that was for an interim basis and was taken away.
Thank you so much, Dr. Ghobrial. That's something that she brings up to the team a lot, actually, is a positive attitude about what good change can come out of this. So we're all very excited to see what can change in the clinic moving forward. That concludes our first section of the 3 sections today, and we're going to move on to a section a little bit more focused on explaining the FDA's role in drug development, just giving everyone a better background and what exactly you do on a day-to-day basis. So on this end, I'm going to turn to Dr. Gormley, and it'd be great if you could give us, as the acting director for the Division of Hematologic Malignancies, just a better explanation of your role in assessing and approving new treatments. What does that look like, kind of on a day-to-day basis?
Sure. So, at the FDA, it was specifically within the Office of Oncologic Diseases, we really are quite a large group of physicians, primarily, supported by other disciplines as well: chemists, statisticians, pharmacologists, etc. And it's really a multidisciplinary approach to the review of these products. And specifically within the Office of Oncologic Diseases, we have approximately 100 oncologists and hematologists that review these products. Within my division, in the Division of Hematologic Malignancies 2, we primarily focus on multiple myeloma, the focus of this call, but then also CLL, chronic lymphocytic leukemia, and other lymphomas, such as follicular lymphoma or diffuse large B-cell lymphoma. And our team, we really are involved with the drug development process from the very beginning all the way through. So oftentimes we'll meet with industry leaders or sponsors on their drug development at the very early stages, before they've even started trials in humans, when they're just looking at the chemistry of the product and various studies that they've conducted in cell lines or things like that. And discussing with them then the design of their initial trials. And then that product will stay with us, and we'll continue to follow along with the company as they enter into trials in patients. And then as they expand and conduct larger trials that are really designed to answer if this product is safe and effective. And so throughout that process, we'll have multiple discussions with them, meetings to discuss how their trial should be designed, what's the best way to answer the question at hand, what populations they should be looking at. And then once they've completed all their trials, they'll submit them to us and we review them. And we review the primary data that they've collected, everything from lab values and vital signs, and then obviously larger outcomes of whether or not this product actually has a large impact on the lives of patients, including patient-reported outcomes and response rates, et cetera. And then ultimately the goal is that we would write a label for a product that we approve that would provide enough information for prescribers that to fully understand the safety profile of the product, what the outcomes were seen in the clinical trials, and then what toxicities are known to occur with that product, et cetera, such that the product can be used safely in the community. And that's our primary regulatory review work. But on top of that, we also really do a lot of engagement. The mission of the FDA is really to protect and to promote the public health by ensuring the safety and efficacy and security of products that are both for humans and the human drugs, and then also veterinary drugs, cosmetics, drugs, biologics, etc. And it's to promote the public health aspect of that that's also really important. And so we engage with a lot of groups. We participate in a lot of outreach opportunities, both with an educational focus, and then also with a lot of patient advocacy groups in terms of what things are needed to move the field forward. And it's those discussions that I think are also really helpful as well, just because the idea being that we're learning so much during this time in oncology, and the FDA is really in a wonderful position to be able to engage with all of the academic groups, patient advocacy groups, and other invested parties, industry, et cetera, to really advance the field and provide more therapeutic options for patients.
Thank you so much. It really almost blows my mind to think about the amount of work that goes behind the scenes for all of these different drugs that are able to be brought to market, let alone for hematological malignancies, let alone for all the things you might get from the pharmacy on a day-to-day basis. So that's very helpful. Thank you so much. As we think about the FDA's role, just as you described, Dr. Gormley, I was wondering if Dr. Kanapuru, if you could kind of describe or answer the question about whether there's been a greater emphasis on oral treatments as a result of COVID-19. I know a lot of people are less willing to go into the clinic, and a lot of clinics are not allowing as many patients in. Have you seen any type of a switch to more oral regimens?
I think definitely in this time of social distancing, I think people there's a lot of questions about how patients or they can keep up with their planned treatment schedules. I don't have any specific information whether there's more emphasis on oral treatments, but the COVID-19 guidance that was mentioned previously does talk about some flexibilities even with regards to having these oral treatments shipped to their houses if they cannot go to the clinic or alternative sites to get the treatment. And so if this can be done safely with maintaining the privacy of these patients, I think there's an option for the oral treatments or drugs that the patients are receiving as part of their clinical trial participation to be shipped to the patient's house. And so I think there's definitely the oral treatments are approved for certain indications, and not all diseases have oral treatments that are approved. And so there are certain patients who, as part of their treatment for the disease, may still need to get intravenous medications or IV infusions. And I think there is, certainly at this time, there is some concern whether they can meet the planned treatment schedule. And the COVID, again, the guidance and FDA again, is looking into that, and it is for receiving intravenous infusions or other treatments off-site. I think there are several considerations that that need to be taken into, because not all intravenous medications can be given away from the clinical trial site. For example, infusion drugs which have more infusion-related reactions that might need more monitoring in the hospital, or even like CAR T therapy cannot be administered, by a healthcare provider at home or in an alternative site. However, if there are situations like that, the sponsors or the investigators can certainly engage with the FDA to see what would be the best way of having these medications given to the patient if the patient requires this treatment for clinical trial as well as for treatment of their disease. And so, it's important that the investigators and the sponsors who are conducting these clinical trials to have discussions with the FDA to see how the patients can get these treatments. But FDA has been, looking, recently that we approved a drug where we've, considered an alternate treatment schedule. For instance, instead of every 3 weeks for the pembrolizumab, it was recently approved for every 6 weeks. Again, this is taking into consideration that people may not be able to, patients may not be able to go into the clinic every 3 weeks, and so having this 6 weeks option just gives them that additional time between which they have to go back into the clinic to get the drug. And as all multiple myeloma, community may be aware, we also had the recent daratumumab subcutaneous drug that was approved early in March. And so for the indications that it's approved for, daratumumab subcutaneous, requires that you administer this drug over 3 to 5 minutes rather than this long infusion period for daratumumab intravenous. And so this reduces the time that the patients need to be at a place, and so possibly can help with them getting this effective treatment if they were receiving it, and also, continue to get the treatment. So I think there are, FDA is considering additional flexibilities, just making sure that the patient safety is not impacted, as well as that the clinical trial participation or the integrity of the trial is maintained, while making sure that the patients are getting the treatment that they need to receive.
Thank you so much, Dr. Kanapuru. It's a very challenging task to try to figure out what's kind of the best compromise right now. And in general, I was hoping to pose to both Dr. Gormley and Dr. Kanapuru. I know you described a little bit about it, but could you just expand a bit on what is the FDA currently doing to better understand the impact of multiple myeloma on COVID-19 symptoms, mortality rate, and other factors?
So this is an area that's very important to us. I think, the COVID-19 pandemic is really quite early, and we're early in our understanding, and we recognize that there's a lot that we need to learn as well about the intersection of COVID-19 with cancer. And so there have been a lot of efforts more broadly trying to fully understand the impact of COVID-19. And I'll mention two briefly that are FDA-wide sort of efforts. The first is the Coronavirus Treatment Acceleration Program. And this is a special emergency program that we've sort of implemented to really expedite and help move new therapies that are designed for COVID-19 to patients as quickly as possible. And just as evidence of that, as of May 11th, there were already 144 active clinical trials of therapeutics designed to treat coronavirus, COVID-19. And an additional 457 programs that were in these planning stages that I mentioned earlier. So there's a lot of effort and resources that are being put forward to try to really advance therapies for COVID-19. And some have been designed specifically with the cancer patient population in mind. So some of these trials are also specifically just looking at treatment in patients with cancer and COVID. And our office, the Office of Oncologic Diseases, has been largely involved with those development programs and trials. Additionally, there is a COVID-19 evidence accelerator, and this was just recently established, and with a goal of really trying to utilize multiple streams of information real time. So using real world data in particular to sort of characterize one, the COVID-19 natural history and its sequelae, but then also answer really important treatment cancer questions. And I think in particular with patients with cancer and COVID-19, it's a really important aspect. And I think a lot of information is there to be gleaned from real world data, because we realize that this is a unique intersection. And there's a lot of unanswered questions really about this disease in our patients.
Thank you so much. That's perfect, and it really encompasses the fact that we all need to continue to work together to come up with various strategies that will help the patients who are impacted by both COVID as well as cancer. And with that, we did finish up our second section of our 3 sections today on FDA drug development approval and role in COVID-19. So thank you so much for that. And we're going to transition to our last section of the evening, which is going to be on treatment and research. And with this, I'll turn to Dr. Ghobrial. I was wondering if you could provide a quick explanation on how multiple myeloma, as well as its precursor conditions, impacts the immune system, and why do these impacts affect the prognosis of multiple myeloma patients, specifically who are diagnosed with COVID-19? Are there certain multiple myeloma therapies that patients should avoid during the pandemic?
Thank you, Annie. So these are a lot of questions, so I'm going to take it one by one. And again, the main answer is there is so much to be known. We still don't know so many things about the immune system and how it regulates cancer progression and how it interacts with the therapy we give. So I hope that in the next 10, 15 years, we get to know even more than where we are right now. But I can tell you where we are right now, at least from the beginning. If we look at MGUS, we know that the immune system is not completely normal. And this was recent data that we just got when we did something called single cell RNA sequencing, meaning we take your bone marrow cells, and I know many of you don't like bone marrow biopsies, but this is one of the reasons why. And we look at the immune cells, and instead of looking at them in bulk, we look at them at one cell at a time, sort of looking at a forest versus each single tree and trying to understand what is the role of that tree in the big picture. So it's a very sensitive method to tell us that your NK cells, your T cells, your B cells, how are they functioning together with your cancer cells? And are they bad or good for your own immune system? And will they allow progression or will they prevent progression to myeloma? So this is what we do when we take those bone marrow biopsies and we look at them. Now, we know that your immune system is likely more normal than abnormal when you're early on in MGUS, but then it starts getting more and more changes that get worse and worse, meaning that your immune system gets worse as you progress to active myeloma. And that's even before we start giving you therapy. Now, if we start giving you therapy, the worst drug, not the worst drug, but one of the bad drugs that we give you is something called dexamethasone, which is steroids. Now, steroids are really good to kill plasma cells, which are the myeloma cells. So that's why we've been using them for years and years, but they're really bad for T cells. They kill all the immune cells. So we sort of have this, conundrum of, should we give you the high dose dexamethasone or not? Should we cut down the dose or not? And this is where we are with many of our therapies. When we treat every patient with myeloma today, we start thinking, should I give you this drug because it will kill the myeloma cells, or will it have an effect on the immune system? Now, we're lucky that there's a new era of immunotherapy coming along. So we mentioned CAR-T, but there is all of the other immunotherapies coming along, including bispecifics and so on. And maybe some of our patients, we will treat them without the dexamethasone, but with more immune-related drugs that can activate your own immune system and not kill your own immune cells. And by doing that, it will actually control your cancer cells. So there's a lot to be understood in that area. Coming to COVID-19, we really don't know the answer. We know that plasma cells, which are the cancer cells in your case, in myeloma, are really important for making antibodies. And we know that actually when we vaccinate patients, even at the MGUS stages, sometimes your vaccine doesn't work that well, even at MGUS or smoldering. So we know that you're not capable of making all of the great antibodies that can fight all of the infections. We don't know how you're going to react to COVID-19. We know that currently some of the cases we're seeing, some of them are myeloma cases, but it's hard to know whether that's because of your own underlying immune system or is it from the drugs that we gave you, like dexamethasone, which ones are good, which ones are bad. And that's why we're doing all of those studies right now to understand that. And in fact, we hopefully will launch soon a study just for MGUS and smoldering so that we can delineate the difference between myeloma when you actively have therapy from earlier stages when you're not getting therapy, but your immune system is still changing, and can tell the difference between COVID-19 infected or not. So that will be launched for all the PROMISE and PCROUD patients who are online right now. It will be called Sapphire. So hopefully you look for it soon. And again, it's just purely getting samples from patients and trying to understand that by answering the questions of the immune cells and how they regulate the system, especially in COVID-19 situations.
Thank you so much, Dr. Ghobrial. And I know that that's very frustrating for a lot of people to hear because it's nice to have black and white answers, but unfortunately there's a lot of gray right now. And that's why research is so important when we're talking about the difference between precursor patients and COVID-19 and myeloma patients and COVID-19 and healthy patients and COVID-19. So stay tuned for some exciting updates from our team. Hopefully we will try to work on getting some of those answers for you. An important question, which again, I don't know if we have an answer for, but Dr. Ghobrial, if someone who has either MGUS or smoldering does contract COVID-19, could this cause their precursor disease to progress? We've gotten this question quite a bit.
That's an interesting question. We don't have the answer, so it's hard to understand that. But I think that's why it's very important for us to get the data and understand what's going on with every patient. So it's actually you as patients are part of that answer, part of making us understand what to do in the future. And it's very important to actually be part of this. I always say that the patients are the most powerful part of any research study, because you're the one who are helping us answer that question. So hopefully join any of those tissue banking studies, not just ours, but any of the institutions who have some of those questions to be answered, because it's truly your blood sample that can help us understand that question.
Perfect, thank you. All right, we've come to our last organized question for the evening, and then we'll turn with one more, and then we'll turn to some of the submitted questions. But I wanted to close out and ask Dr. Kanapuru and Dr. Gormley, I know there's a lot of talk about future vaccines for COVID-19, and a lot of that's still up in the air. Do you have any sense of how protective such a vaccine would be for a patient who has a precursor condition compared to someone in the general population?
Yes. So thank you for that question. I think again, this is something that we don't have a good answer at this time. As was mentioned by Dr. Ghobrial, it's really the patients. The patients have to lead the way. So there are if there are clinical trials open, participating in the clinical trials so that we have all these important answers is very important. At this time, I think it's too early to say, too early, or everything is just new, and we are trying to learn answers to multiple questions at one time. But it's important the patients enroll on clinical trials. So with that, we do have the answers to all of these important questions that are being asked.
Perfect. Thank you so much. Thank you again, all three of you, for being here with us today. We're going to turn now to submitted questions that came in over the course of around 24 hours beforehand via our email, as well as through the chat, which is ongoing right now. There's so many of them, and I wish we could answer them all. And I do apologize that we're not going to be able to, but I'm going to try my best to pick ones that are that really go across a couple of questions. So hopefully it'll answer for a couple of people. I want to start off with something pretty basic and really important. This is a patient who has smoldering, and the question is, if I start to get COVID symptoms, what should I do?
Well, I think the first thing is calling your doctor. I think that's the most important thing. Whether you have MGUS, smoldering, myeloma, healthy, anyone who has COVID symptoms, it's important to seek care and then to go through the process, getting tested, getting to the appropriate care, because it's very important to know that early on, getting access to healthcare would be very important so that you don't get worse and worse. And I would say that that's true for all of us, rather than saying, well, I'll wait a little bit, because many of us will always say, well, it's just a fever or it's just a cough. Again, it's being aware of your symptoms and seeking care early on.
Absolutely, and there's information on the CDC's website about the exact steps to take, and definitely just stay in touch with your hematologist or primary care physician about the best steps for you as personally. Another great question that came through that I think we've kind of answered this in the past, but I do think it's something important, and we have a lot of people who continue to ask this question. So the quick question is, will having MGUS or smoldering give me a false positive on a COVID-19 test? I think the larger question is, how exactly do these COVID-19 tests work? Maybe I can pose that to Dr. Gormley and Dr. Ghobrial. Feel free to jump in, however.
I'll actually let Dr. Ghobrial answer this one, but a variety of tests out there currently that have been granted initial authorization and emergency use authorization as well. And so I think, that has to figure into the considerations as well, and that just that there are a variety of tests, and whether or not we're talking about diagnosis or we're talking about a serologic assessment for antibodies afterwards, there's lots of different considerations. But I'll let her answer as well.
Yeah, I mean, I really don't know exactly whether we will be very precise or not. I think that's why there are so many studies being developed right now and trying to understand better how the testing is being performed. And I'm sure we will get more and more sensitive testings and we will understand the disease better. I think right now, at least from what we understand, the immunoglobulin tests are specific for the IgG or the IgM are specific for the COVID-19. Knowing sensitivity and specificity for each test is very important because we don't want to have false positive or false negative. And it will be important to have many of our patients with MGUS and myeloma tested so that we can understand better how potentially there could be an interaction. Likely not, but we don't know until we prove it and until we have precise testing and until we have data to prove what's going on with the patients.
Absolutely. Thank you both for answering that question. I think it's a really important one, particularly as testing becomes more widespread. The next question that we have is an interesting one. It's kind of epidemiological. It's about whether stress can cause progression, and I think the larger question here is what do we know can cause progression? What kinds of epidemiological variables impact progression from MGUS and smoldering to overt disease? Dr. Ghobrial, sorry, if you could answer that one, that'd be great.
No, that's okay. I wasn't sure. Yeah, we can all answer it, right? You know, we still have a lot of questions to answer. There are, again, some of the questions are there genetic or epigenetic questions inside the cancer cell? Are we born to be more susceptible? And that's why we're asking questions of African American or of African descent, or if you have a family history, because maybe we inherit something that predisposes us. And then you start asking the questions, is the cancer cell acquiring something that's genetic or epigenetic that leads to progression, that allows it to grow much more? And then you ask questions, what is in the microenvironment, which is whether it's immune or non-immune, that allows these to grow? And then you start asking questions of what else in that macro environment, meaning obesity, health issues. Do I have autoimmune diseases or not? Do I have diabetes or not? Am I taking medications that increase the risk or decrease the risk? So that's why it's so complicated to understand what causes progression. And when we look at clinical markers that we use right now, when we sit with patients with MGUS and smoldering and tell them, well, based on those 3 markers, M-spike, light chain, and bone marrow, I can give you an assessment of your risk. We know that that's not very accurate. And what we're trying to do is get to a better accuracy. And I think one of the best examples, one of my colleagues called it, is that it's predicting the hurricane. You know that when you go on the channel, on the weather channel, you want that person tells you that the hurricane is coming on that day and it's going to hit this area. You don't want him to say it's going to be all over the United States and it may be in the next 5 years. You want some accuracy. And that's what we're trying to do, more accuracy in predicting who will progress so that we can actually treat the patients who should be treated early on and not wait for them to progress, and not overtreat other patients who will not. So we're starting to work on those biomarkers of progression so that we can give you better accuracy. When we sit down with you, we can be more predictive in who will progress truly in their lifetime.
Thank you, Dr. Ghobrial, for answering that question. That's definitely an important one and one that a lot of patients have. I'm going to close out on one final question, and Dr. Ghobrial actually hinted at this earlier, but we know a lot of people don't like bone marrow biopsies. However, there's a lot of questions about when to get one and the importance of getting one at certain time points. So if you're a patient who has MGUS and smoldering, obviously this is different per person. You should be working with your hematologist to make these types of decisions. But in general, when does a hematologist decide to do a bone marrow biopsy on a precursor patient?
I was hoping you'd give that question to Nicole or anyone else other than me, right? So maybe all of us can answer that question. So I know bone marrow biopsies hurt. It's not fun. And we've been doing them the exact same way we've been doing them, I think, over the last, 60, 70 years. We haven't changed. Hopefully we will in the future. But they give us information. And the reason we do them is we're trying to get inside the area of your bone marrow so that we can understand what cancer cells you have, not just the number, but what's inside them, DNA, chromosomes, all of those, because it's important to tell us if you have bad chromosomes and bad changes or not. And then it also tells us what else is going on in your immune system in that bone marrow biopsy. The hope is that we have less and less of those to use in the future. In fact, I think myeloma is probably one of the best ones to have a blood biomarker. So many other cancers are now getting excited that they have something called liquid biopsy or blood biopsy, where we can see the DNA of your tumor cells that are stuck inside your cancer, but we can actually see pieces of the DNA called cell-free DNA or circulating tumor cells or other things that spill out in the blood, and we can dig the blood and understand better the disease instead of doing all those biopsies. And that's hopefully the future. And indeed, we are doing liquid biopsies in myeloma. But believe it or not, M-spike and light chain have been the best biomarkers in your blood that predict what will happen in your bone marrow. So we've been way ahead other cancers in using your blood as a measurement of what's going on in your bone marrow, which helps us doing less and less of bone marrow biopsies. We do need bone marrow biopsies when we think you're progressing because we want to understand should we treat you or not. We need a bone marrow biopsy sometimes to understand what else is going on. Are you changing post-therapy? Is there a new chromosomal change that we need to be more aggressive in your treatment or not? So we needed to make changes in the decision-making and not just for the fun of it. But I'll let Nicole and Bindu decide whether there are any other things for bone marrow biopsies.
No, I think you covered it perfectly. It is an uncomfortable procedure, and it's something we don't want to do unnecessarily. And so even in clinical trials, when they are included as part of the assessments, it's done to really make sure that we're gleaning enough information about the individual patient to be useful. And there's always that balance there because it is unpleasant. So.
Yeah, certainly. I just echo both the thoughts. You do want to keep, these are invasive procedures, but they are required sometimes to ensure that you're not either over-treating or under-treating. And so they are important when they can help guide treatment decisions. But I think everybody who's doing a bone marrow or has done a bone marrow, I think, is very cognizant of the fact that this is an uncomfortable procedure. And so the idea of doing the bone marrow is to help with the treatment decisions. But hopefully there will be a day where, maybe we don't need it. But at this time, I think they're very helpful to guide treatment decisions. And they will be a part of the treatment for now.
Thank you so much for answering that one. I know it's a tricky one. And I will say we work with a lot of patient advocates. And I think one thing that a couple of them have brought up to me is actually that just talking to it, especially if it's your first bone marrow biopsy, talking to a patient who's gone through it before is very helpful just to know what to expect. I think that helps with most things in life, but particularly with something that might be a little bit nerve-wracking like a bone marrow biopsy. These are great questions. Thank you everyone for submitting them. At this point, we've come to the end of our time limit for the day. So I'm just going to close off quickly with a quick few plugs. Please follow us on our YouTube channel. It's the Promise Study YouTube channel. We're going to get a very cool link with a name pretty soon, but we have to have 100 followers. So if you're the 100th person to follow us, you're going to get a big applause from our Ghobrial team here. So you can follow us on our YouTube channel, and you'll be able to stay in touch and learn more about our upcoming webinars, which we're going to be doing regularly by following us. We also would love to encourage you to continue to check out the Promise and the PCrowd studies, which we have the URL of the Promise study here below, and the PCrowd study is the same thing, but at pcrowd.org. If you have any questions, feel free to reach out to our research team about either of those projects. Finally, I really want to thank Dr. Gormley and Dr. Kanapuru because it's been a huge help to hear what the FDA does, and the OCE and the Division of Hematologic Malignancies. These are really important groups that support all the work that we do, and without you and your teams, it would be very hard to get a lot of the stuff done that we do. So thank you for being with us today. I know you're all very busy people, and I appreciate you coming and speaking with us and the patients today.